The first whispers reached the settlement of Red Canyon on a wind that carried dust and rumors in equal measure. By the time the story took root, it was no longer just gossip. It had become a challenge that seemed to echo across every saloon, every bunkhouse, and every lonely line shack scattered through the territory. They said a widow named Eleanor Vance, tall and proud despite the hardships carved into her face, owned a stallion black as midnight and twice as dangerous. The horse had thrown every rider who dared approach 20 men or more, and left each one limping, cursing, or swearing, never to touch reins again. Yet the prize she offered still pulled men like moths toward a flame. They could not resist $50 in gold to the man who could ride the beast for 10 straight minutes. $50 was no small fortune. It was a stake large enough to buy a parcel of land to start a herd, even to pay off debts that had chained many men to ranchers or railroads. But gold was not the only lure. Pride, reputation, and the desire to prove oneself in front of the town's watchful eyes pushed one cowboy after another toward the corral at the Vance Ranch. The spectacle became a kind of frontier theater, each performance ending with the same violent climax the stallion called Shadowfire would rear and buck with such savage precision that no man lasted longer than a minute, sometimes less. The doctor in Red Canyon stitched more split lips and wrapped more broken ribs than he cared to count. The widow Eleanor watched from her porch each time. Her figure was rigid, her arms crossed her face unreadable as though carved from weathered oak. Some said she was cruel, delighting in watching men flung into the dirt. Others whispered she was looking for something more than entertainment, that perhaps she was testing the spirit of the men, searching for a partner who understood that true strength was not about breaking wildness, but respecting it. The truth, though, was known only to her. And in her silence, she carried the memory of her late husband, Samuel Vance, the only man who had ever ridden Shadowfire without force. It happened just once, days before fever consumed him, when he had mounted the stallion and moved with him in a dance so seamless that those who saw it swore horse and rider were made of the same breath. For 3 years since his passing, Eleanor had guarded the stallion like a sacred trust. Men came and failed their arrogance, ground into the dust of her corral. Shadowfire seemed to embody grief itself, untamable, fierce, and unwilling to bow to anyone. Yet Eleanor believed that somewhere out there was a man who could understand what Samuel had understood, that some bonds cannot be forged with whips or sugar cubes, but only through patience and truth. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon and long shadows stretched over the valley, a stranger rode into Red Canyon. His name was Silas McCoy, though few knew it then. He was a man hollowed by years of drifting, the kind of cowboy whose eyes carried the weight of places he would never speak about. The war had left scars deeper than any bullet could carve, and solitude had become both shield and prison. He worked odd jobs on distant spreads, fixing fence lines, driving cattle, always leaving before anyone could get too close. In his saddlebag, he carried little more than a worn Bible with missing pages and a harmonica he no longer played. At the saloon that night, he heard the talk. A widow's challenge, a devil's stallion, $50 in gold. Most men laughed or cursed the impossibility. Silas said nothing. He sat at the end of the bar nursing coffee gone cold, staring at the smoke curling from the lamps as if it carried some secret message. But inside him something stirred, faint and insistent, like the first glimmer of dawn through shutter cracks. It was not the money that caught his attention, nor the chance at glory. It was the story of a horse who chose no man, who had waited 3 years as though searching for something. Silas understood waiting. He had been waiting for years, though he could not have said for what. The next morning he saddled his bay gelding, a steady beast named Arrow, and rode toward the Vance Ranch. The trail wound through dry creek beds and sandstone cliffs, the air heavy with heat and the smell of sagebrush. As he rode, memories pressed against him, the crack of rifles in smoky forests, the cries of men who never rose again, the way silence afterward could weigh heavier than battle. Silas tightened his grip on the reins, trying to push the ghosts back into the shadows where they belonged. But he knew even before the ranch came into view that something about this challenge was different. This was not just about a horse. This was about facing himself. When he reached the ranch, a crowd had already gathered around the corral. Townsfolk, drifters, and ranch hands leaned against the rails, eager for another show of dust and failure. Inside the pen, Shadowfire stood like a storm-made flesh. The stallion's coat shimmered black-blue in the sun, muscles, coiled eyes burning with intelligence and defiance. Even standing still, he radiated power that made lesser men shift uneasily. And young Cowboy had just climbed the fence. Pride clung to him like perfume, his silver spurs glinting as he strutted toward the horse. He cracked a whip in the air, shouting, "We'll see how wild you are now." The stallion's ears pinned flat. In a heartbeat, Shadowfire launched upward, front hooves striking the sky, then twisted with deadly grace. The boy was airborne before the crowd even gasped, crashing against the fence in a heap of dust and curses. Laughter and jeers rose, but Eleanor did not smile. She simply turned her gaze back to the stallion, her eyes narrowing as if measuring something invisible. Silas watched in silence, his hand resting lightly on Arrow's neck. He felt no urge to laugh. He felt only a strange pull, as though Shadowfire's restless pacing spoke directly to some hunger inside his own chest. When the boy limped away, Silas dismounted and stepped toward the fence. Conversations quieted. Strangers eyed him with curiosity. He was taller than most, lean but wiry, his beard flecked with gray, though his shoulders still carried the strength of younger years. His clothes were plain, his gear worn but well kept. Nothing about him announced bravado. Instead, there was a gravity, the kind that came from surviving storms that would have broken others. Eleanor noticed him at once. From her porch, she studied his steady walk, the way his eyes never left the stallion. There was no swagger, no attempt to draw attention. He moved like a man who belonged near horses, like one who had more conversations with them than with people. For the first time in months, something shifted in her chest, a flicker of interest, a question she could not yet name. When Silas reached the fence, he did not climb over. He simply leaned against the rail, his arms folded loosely, his gaze calm. Shadowfire stopped pacing, ears flicking forward, nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of this new presence. For a long moment, neither man nor horse moved. The crowd murmured impatiently, expecting another show of arrogance. But Silas only spoke softly, his voice carrying no further than the animal's ears. "Easy there, partner," he said. "I'm not here to take what you don't want to give." A hush settled over the corral. It was the beginning of something no one in Red Canyon could yet understand, least of all Silas himself. Shadowfire's ears twitched as the sound of Silas's voice slipped across the corral like wind through dry grass. It was not a command, not the harsh bark so many men had thrown at him. It was quiet, steady, carrying something the stallion had not heard in years' truth. He shifted his weight muscles rippling beneath his coat and lowered his head just slightly enough to let everyone watching know he was listening. The crowd grew restless. Someone called out, "Are you going to ride him or just whisper sweet nothings?" Laughter rippled along the fence, but Silas did not flinch. His gaze never left the stallion, his body still as stone. He had learned long ago that animals like men carried wounds invisible to the eye. Rushing only tore them deeper. Eleanor Vance stepped down from the porch. The wooden steps creaked beneath her boots, but her stride was purposeful, her back straight as a rifle barrel. She approached the corral, folding her arms across her chest. "You here to try your luck, stranger?" Her voice carried the kind of steel that made men hesitate, but Silas only tipped his hat politely without looking away from the horse. "Ma'am," he said, "I didn't come for luck." The answer seemed to catch her off guard. For 3 years, she had heard every brand of boasting, every promise of conquest, every declaration from men who believed they could break Shadowfire with strength or trickery. This one spoke like he was talking about something else entirely. Her eyes narrowed as she studied him, measuring whether the calm in his voice was arrogance or something rarer. Shadowfire pawed the ground, sending up a puff of dust. Silas's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "You're a proud one," he murmured. "Not wild without reason. You've been carrying battles no man here ever bothered to see." The stallion's ears flicked forward, and for the first time since the challenge had begun months ago, he took a step closer instead of away. The crowd went silent. Every breath held as if they feared a word might break the fragile thread spinning between horse and man. Eleanor watched with a pounding heart she would never admit to. There was something hauntingly familiar in the way the stranger stood patient, steady, unthreatening. It was the way Samuel, her husband, had once approached the stallion. Memory pressed hard against her ribs, but she forced it down. Memory was not proof. Silas finally turned to meet her eyes. Tell me, ma'am, what exactly are you asking these men to prove? Is it their strength, their courage, or is it something else? The question was simple, yet it cut deeper than she expected. For 3 years, she had told herself she wanted a rider for Shadowfire, someone who could succeed where others had failed. But underneath, she had been searching for a man who saw what Samuel had seen. That riding was not about conquest. It was about recognition. She lifted her chin, meeting Silas's steady gaze. I'm asking them to prove they're real cowboys, that they understand some things can't be broken. Silas gave a slow nod, his expression unreadable. Then maybe Shadowfire's been waiting for the wrong kind of man all this time. Murmurs stirred in the crowd. Some scoffed at his calm words, muttering that the stranger was stalling. Others leaned forward, unable to look away from the strange stillness unfolding in the corral. Silas placed his hands lightly on the rail and vaulted over in a single smooth motion. He landed in the dust with the grace of someone who had done it 1,000 times before, then stood still again, not advancing. Shadow fire blew through his nostrils, circling slowly, his hooves pressing deliberate patterns into the earth. The distance between them was 10 feet, maybe less, but it felt like the width of a canyon. Silas didn't chase him. He only turned enough to keep facing the stallion, his body language loose, his shoulders lowered. Every fiber of him said, I'm not here to fight. What's your name? Eleanor called, her voice sharper than she intended. Silas McCoy, he answered. The name meant nothing to most, but a few older ranch hands exchanged quiet glances. Stories of a soldier who had ridden messenger lines during the war. A man who lost more than he ever gained had drifted across the plains. But Silas offered no explanation. His past was his own. Shadowfire's circle tightened. Dust clung to his legs. His dark eyes locked on the stranger in the pen. For 3 years he had tossed men aside like rag dolls. Yet something in this man's stillness made him pause. It was not submission he saw. It was recognition, the kind that only comes from another soul that has been scarred. Silas lifted a hand slowly, palm open. No rope, no whip, no bribe, just an offering. The stallion stopped moving. The silence was so thick even the wind seemed to die. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had seen this once before in her husband's last days when Shadowfire had bowed his head and allowed himself to be touched. The crowd leaned forward, but no one dared speak. Shadowfire's massive chest rose and fell. Then with a deliberate step that seemed to shake the earth, he closed the distance by half. The crowd gasped as though they'd all been holding the same breath. Silas did not move his hand further, did not rush. He only waited, his eyes steady, his voice low. It's your choice, he whispered. Always your choice. And for the first time in years, Shadowfire stretched his muzzle forward until his breath fanned hot against the stranger's fingers. The moment Shadowfire's breath brushed his hand, Silas felt it like a spark running through his veins. Not fear, not triumph, but something older, something he had almost forgotten: connection. He stood as still as stone, letting the stallion decide how much contact to give. The crowd, restless for drama, fidgeted along the fence rails, but no one dared break the silence. Even the children who had slipped under their mothers' skirts stared wide-eyed, their usual giggles hushed by awe. Shadowfire sniffed once, twice, then blew a hot gust across Silas's palm before jerking his head back. The test was not finished, not by a long stretch, but he had not turned away completely. That was more than any other man had managed in 3 long years. Silas slowly lowered his hand, not pressing the moment further. Patience was as much for himself as for the horse. He could feel the tension coiled in every muscle of his body, memories trying to claw their way forward, horses screaming in wartime chaos, friends thrown and never rising again, his own desperate fight to hold on when the world tried to buck him off. He swallowed hard and breathed slow. This was not the battlefield. This was something entirely different. Eleanor's voice drifted across the corral, softer now, stripped of its earlier challenge. You don't force him. Silas turned his head slightly, meeting her eyes across the dust and fence. There's no winning with force, he said simply. Not with animals, not with people. Force only proves how little you understand. Her lips parted as if to reply, then closed again. She had heard 100 excuses from men who failed, but none had spoken like that. It was as if he was talking about more than horses, as if he was talking about life itself. Shadowfire stamped his hoof impatient. His dark eyes glimmered with the same storm that had thrown every challenger before. But Silas noticed something beneath it. Weariness. This horse was tired of battles, tired of proving his strength by breaking men. He wanted something else, though, perhaps he did not know what. Silas stepped sideways, keeping his movements smooth circling, just enough to mirror the stallion's restless pacing. Shadowfire swung his head ears, flicking, but he did not retreat. They circled together, two wary souls testing each other in the language of motion. The crowd grew louder again, whispering predictions, trading bets under their breath. Some scoffed that Silas was stalling, afraid to climb on. Others leaned forward, sensing the fragile thread weaving tighter with each step. Eleanor stood apart from them, her arms folded, her gaze fixed sharp as a hawk. She was weighing him, not just his skill, but his heart. Minutes stretched like hours. Silas finally spoke again, his words no louder than before. "I won't climb on your back until you tell me it's time." Shadowfire stopped circling. His ears pinned, then relaxed. His muscles quivered, and with a sharp snort he stepped closer. Dust swirled in the heat between them, golden in the sinking sun. Silas extended his hand once more, palm open. This time the stallion pressed his muzzle firmly against it. The crowd gasped in unison. A few men swore under their breath. Eleanor's throat tightened as memory surged the last time she had seen Shadowfire allow such a touch, her husband's fevered body swaying in the saddle, yet somehow finding rhythm with the stallion's power. Silas let his fingers brush along the broad line of Shadowfire's cheek down the muscled arch of his neck. Each touch was deliberate, respectful, asking rather than taking. The stallion shuddered, half ready to explode, half ready to yield. "Easy," Silas whispered. "I know what it's like to fight too long, but maybe we don't have to fight anymore." The words, though meant for the horse, slid like an arrow into Eleanor's chest. Her eyes burned, but she did not look away. Silas drew the rope halter from where it hung loosely around his wrist. He didn't lunge forward or snap it into place. Instead, he held it low, letting Shadowfire see it, smell it, choose. The stallion's ears flicked back, nostrils flaring, but he did not retreat. Slowly, impossibly, he allowed Silas to slip the rope over his head. A murmur swept the crowd. Someone muttered, "I'll be damned." Another spat in the dust, muttering about tricks, but most simply stared transfixed. Silas gave the rope a light tug, not to command but to test. Shadowfire's head twitched, but he did not explode. Instead, he shifted his weight and stood, his chest rising and falling like thunder caged in flesh. Silas looked back at Eleanor. "He'll let me try," he said. Her breath caught. She nodded once, though her heart hammered so hard it felt like it might break through her ribs. "Then don't waste it, Silas McCoy. He's waited long enough." Silas placed a hand on the stallion's shoulder, steadying himself. He knew the next steps had to be measured in heartbeats, not minutes. He slid his foot into the stirrup, but paused. Shadowfire's muscles quivered, but he didn't rear. The crowd pressed forward, voices rising with anticipation. Eleanor whispered to herself a prayer she hadn't spoken since her husband's last ride. Silas swung his legs slowly, carefully, and for the first time in 3 years, a man settled into the storm's back without being thrown. The instant Silas settled into the saddle, Shadowfire stiffened like a bow pulled taut. Every muscle in the stallion's body coiled with explosive potential. His neck arched, his ears flicked back, and the corral seemed to shrink around them, too small to contain what was about to be unleashed. The crowd surged closer to the rails, hungry for the violence they were certain would follow. For 3 years, Shadowfire had thrown every man who dared touch his back. Some had lasted seconds. A few had stretched to minutes, but all had fallen broken and humiliated. The stallion had become legend, not just for his fury, but for his precision. When he bucked, it was not wild chaos, it was war strategy, each twist and strike calculated to remind men that freedom could not be stolen. Silas leaned forward slightly, his hands loose on the rope halter, his body relaxed as though he were sitting on a porch chair, rather than a storm bound in flesh. He breathed deep, grounding himself, feeling the heat of the stallion's body beneath him. "Easy now," he whispered, though his voice trembled from the strain of waiting. "I'm not here to cage you." Shadowfire's hooves struck the ground like cannon fire. He launched upward, front legs slashing the air, hindquarters kicking with bone-crushing force. The crowd roared. Dust exploded into the sky, blotting out the sun. Silas's vision blurred, but he moved with the horse not against him. His hips rolled with each violent surge, his legs clamped, but not crushing, his hands guiding but not yanking. The stallion twisted sideways midair, a move that had shattered more than one rib in the past. Silas's teeth ground together, pain lancing through his body as the world spun, but he stayed centered, flowing with the motion like water spilling across stone. "Hold on, damn you!" someone shouted from the rail. Others shouted bets, cheers, curses, their voices a storm of human chaos. But Silas heard none of it. His ears rang only with the thunder of hooves, the rush of breath, the hammer of his own heart. Shadowfire plunged forward, head low, spine arched, throwing every ounce of fury into dislodging the man who dared to cling to him. Silas bent with him, refusing to fight the motion. Instead, he gave space where needed leaning, when the stallion lunged, sitting deep, when he bucked, whispering steady words, even when his throat felt raw. "You're not alone in this," he rasped. "Not anymore." The stallion screamed a sound not of fear, but of rage and anguish pent up from years of misunderstanding. It tore across the valley like a battle cry, rattling the bones of every man, woman, and child who heard it. Silas's ears rang, but his resolve hardened. He had heard that same cry in men once, on fields littered with broken bodies, where no one had listened, where no one had cared. Shadowfire reared so high his shadow cut across the corral fence, his body a silhouette against the bleeding orange sky. Silas clung to the rope, but his strength was failing. His arms burned, his thighs screamed, his vision spotted with black. The stallion slammed back to earth with the force of an earthquake, and for a heartbeat Silas nearly flew. But something changed in that instant. Instead of pulling back, Silas leaned forward, pressing his chest close to the horse's neck, whispering directly into the ear that flicked back toward him. "I know you're tired of fighting," he gasped. "So am I." The stallion's body shuddered, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper, a hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty. For the first time in years, Shadowfire faltered. The violence slowed. The bucking lost its edge, became less about throwing, more about testing. Eleanor clutched the porch rail, her knuckles white. She remembered her husband's last ride, the fever burning him hollow, but his soul shining bright as he swayed in rhythm with this same horse. Now watching Silas, she saw echoes of that moment, but something more. It wasn't just mastery she witnessed, it was recognition. Silas rode the stallion's slowing storm, each violent surge softening until Shadowfire was no longer trying to throw him, but simply carrying him in restless circles. Sweat lathered the horse's neck. His breath came in ragged bursts, and dust coated them both until man and beast looked carved from the same earth. Time stretched. 10 seconds, 30, a minute. The crowd's jeers fell into silence. No one moved, no one breathed. It was as if the entire valley held its breath, waiting for the inevitable fall. But Silas did not fall. He straightened slowly, his back aligned with the stallion's spine, his eyes steady on the horizon. His hand loosened on the rope, giving the horse space, giving him trust. Shadowfire slowed his steps, still tense, but no longer murderous. And then impossibly the stallion stopped. Dust swirled around them like smoke after a battle. Silence rang louder than gunfire. Shadowfire's chest heaved, his flanks trembled, but he stood still with Silas on his back. No one had ever seen him stand. Eleanor's lips parted, her breath catching in her throat. Tears she did not expect stung her eyes. Silas leaned down, brushing his hand gently along the stallion's soaked neck. "Thank you," he whispered. The crowd erupted, cheers, disbelief, curses, all. Some stormed away, muttering that it was trickery. Others shouted that they had witnessed a miracle. But none could deny what they had just seen, a man riding the storm and finding peace within it. Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes locked on Silas. Her voice, though barely audible above the uproar, carried straight to him. "He chose you." Silas looked down at her, dust-streaked, sweat-drenched, exhausted to his core, but steadier than he had felt in years. He touched the brim of his hat, his voice rough as gravel. "No, ma'am. We chose each other." The corral emptied slower than a church after Sunday sermon. Men lingering at the rails, some muttering disbelief, others shaking their heads like they'd seen the devil himself blink. Boys who had spent the afternoon jeering now stared with wide eyes, memorizing every motion, every whisper, every impossible second. No one left without a story to tell, though each would twist it to fit his pride. Some swore the stallion had given up out of exhaustion, Others claimed trickery. But those who had truly watched knew better. They had seen a man and a beast agree to carry one another, and that was rarer than gold in these parts. Eleanor remained on the porch steps, her arms dropped to her sides, palms pressed against her skirts as though she needed to steady herself against the weight of what had just happened. Her chest ached in a way it had not since the night she buried Samuel. Half grief and half something she dared not name. She had sworn she was done waiting for miracles. Yet here one stood covered in dust astride the horse no one else could ride. Silas swung down slowly, his legs stiff from the pounding storm he had just weathered. The stallion turned his head as if to watch, ears forward, eyes clear. Not the gaze of a prisoner, but the watchfulness of a partner. Silas patted his neck once before stepping back, giving space as though to say the test was finished. Shadowfire blew through his nostrils, then lowered his head to grace calm as a gelding in a summer pasture. The crowd gasped again. Some laughed nervously, others fell quiet. A boy's voice broke the silence. "Mister, how'd you do it?" Silas turned his eyes soft, despite the exhaustion in his bones. "I listened," he said. "Nothing more, nothing less." The crowd began to thin. A few clapped him on the shoulder as they passed rough acknowledgments from men too proud to admit awe. Others avoided his gaze, entirely unwilling to face what it meant that they had failed where he had not. Before long, only Eleanor, a handful of ranch hands, and the dust remained. She walked toward him, each step careful but unwavering. When she stood before him, she had to tilt her chin to meet his eyes. "You lasted longer than any man," she said, her voice even, but her throat tight. "He let me stay," Silas replied. His words carried no boast, only truth. Eleanor studied him. The lines in his face spoke of battles fought in silence, scars not just of flesh, but of spirit. She recognized them because she carried her own. For 3 years she had shouldered the ranch, endured whispers of cruelty, brushed off offers of protection she neither wanted nor needed. She had told herself strength meant standing alone. Now, watching this dust-covered stranger who spoke to horses like they were brothers, she felt that belief tremble. "What do you want for it?" she asked finally. $50 was the offer. Silas shook his head. "I didn't climb on him for money." Then why the words slipped out sharper than she intended. He hesitated, his eyes drifting to the stallion, still grazing peacefully as if nothing had happened. "Because I needed to remember what it feels like when something fights you and you don't give up on each other. Been a long time since I had that." The simplicity of it left her silent. She had expected swagger or demand or some claim to glory. Instead, she heard only longing, and it cut her more deeply than any boast ever could. From the barn, one of the hands called out Mrs. Sterling. "What do we do now?" The ranch had lived with Shadowfire's defiance for years, planning work around his storms, mending fences he'd broken, keeping him penned when he should have run free. Eleanor looked at Silas, searching his face. "You rode him once. Would you do it again?" Silas studied her in silence, then gave a single nod. "If he asked me to." That answer pulled something loose inside her. She wanted to scoff to keep her mask of iron in place, but instead a small, fragile laugh escaped, the first in years. Samuel used to say the same thing, she whispered, almost to herself. Silas didn't ask about her husband, though. His eyes softened at the name. He knew the weight of ghosts when they lingered in a woman's voice. Instead, he reached for his hat, dusted it against his thigh, and placed it back on his head. "With your permission, ma'am, I'll stay a while. Seems this horse and I have unfinished business." Eleanor should have said no. She should have sent him on his way, kept her heart guarded, her ranch, hers alone. Yet when she opened her mouth, the words that came out surprised her. "There's a cabin by the north pasture. It's empty. You can sleep there if you choose." Their eyes held 1,000 unsaid truths stretching between them. Shadowfire lifted his head, blowing softly as if sealing the bargain. The cabin by the north pasture was little more than 4 walls and a roof, but to Silas it felt like shelter he hadn't known in years. The floor creaked beneath his boots as he set down his meager belongings, a saddlebag, a worn bedroll, a tin cup, and a knife dulled from use. He lit the lantern, and shadows stretched long across the rough-hewn boards. It smelled of dust, old wood, and the faint memory of tobacco, as though some other cowboy had once made it home before drifting on. The first night was restless. The stallion's cries carried across the valley, not wild and furious, but low like a storm rumbling in its sleep. Silas lay awake on the cot, staring at the ceiling, listening. Each sound pressed against him, not threatening, but reminding him that peace was earned slowly here. Morning came with frost, thick on the grass. When Silas stepped outside, Copper, his bay gelding, was tethered near the fence ears, flicking nervously toward the corral, where Shadowfire paced like a restless spirit. Silas approached with calm steps, boots crunching in the brittle grass. "You haven't decided about me yet, have you?" he said softly. The stallion's ears pinned, then flicked forward, his nostrils flaring. Silas didn't climb the fence, not yet. Instead, he sat on the rail and drank his coffee, letting the steam curl in the cold air, pretending he had all the time in the world. From the main house, Eleanor watched. She had risen early, as always, to see to the chores, but her eyes strayed to the north pasture more often than she cared to admit. The stranger moved with patience she hadn't seen since Samuel, patience that could outlast storms, patience that could wear down even grief. By noon, Silas saddled Copper and rode the fence lines, hammer and nails hanging from his saddle horn. The work was simple but steady, and he lost himself in the rhythm of mending posts, testing wire, and speaking to the horse as though the animal understood every word. When he returned, Shadowfire waited near the corral gate, ears pricked as if measuring him all over again. "Still watching," Silas murmured. "Reckon I'll let you take your time." The days slipped into weeks. Silas worked without being told, repairing barns, digging a new trench for water, riding out to gather stray cattle. He never asked for pay, never spoke of leaving. Each evening he would sit near the corral, sometimes reading from a battered Bible, sometimes just talking to the stallion in a low, even voice. Shadowfire grew curious. One evening, as the sun bled red along the ridge, he stepped close enough that Silas could reach through the rails and scratch behind his ear. The horse snorted, jerked back, then came forward again. The crowd wasn't there to see it, but Eleanor was. She stood at the edge of the porch, arms wrapped around herself, watching silently as something shifted in her chest. Her ranch hands noticed too. One grumbled, "He's witching that horse with words." Another shook his head. "No, he's just seeing him for what he is." But not all the talk was kind. In town, whispers spread fast. Folks said the widow had taken in a drifter, that she was playing a dangerous game letting him stay. Some called it folly, others called it loneliness. But Eleanor ignored them. She had grown used to whispers since Samuel's death. Still, her own heart betrayed her at times. When Silas rode in from the far pasture, shoulders bowed under the weight of honest labor, she caught herself looking too long. When his voice carried through the dusk, steady and low, she felt steadied too, though she would never say it. One night near the end of the second month, the storm came. Thunder rolled across the valley, lightning split the sky, and rain lashed the earth like whips. Fences buckled under the wind. The barn roof threatened to tear loose, and the cattle scattered in panic. Silas was already in the saddle before anyone called for him. Copper plunged into the dark mud, flying reins stinging like needles. He rode hard, rounding strays, driving them back toward safety, with the grit of a man who had ridden through worse than weather. His shout cut through the storm, sharp and steady, and the herd followed like they trusted him more than the earth beneath their hooves. But it was Shadowfire who broke free. Lightning struck close, and the stallion reared high, screaming, breaking the corral fence as though it were matchsticks. He bolted into the storm, a black streak swallowed by rain and thunder. Eleanor's cry carried across the yard. Shadowfire. Without thinking, Silas spurred Copper hard, chasing the stallion's trail into the hills. Mud sucked at his boots branches, whipped his face, but he pressed on, eyes locked on flashes of black against sheets of white rain. Copper struggled to keep pace, but Silas urged him, steady speaking, low, refusing to let fear rule him. They caught Shadowfire near a ravine, where water roared, swollen from the storm. The stallion paced the edge, wild-eyed, half-mad with panic. One wrong step and he would tumble into the torrent below. Silas dismounted, boots sinking into mud, and raised his hands. His voice was nearly lost in the thunder. "Easy, boy. It's me. You know me." Shadowfire spun, hooves striking sparks from stone. Silas edged closer, mud clinging to his legs, rain pouring down his face. "I won't trap you. I won't tie you. I just came to stand with you." For a long, breathless moment, the stallion teetered between rage and trust, his muscles quivering under the storm's fury. Then slowly he stepped away from the edge. Silas pressed a hand to his neck, rain and sweat mingling on his skin. Together they stood battered by wind lightning cracking above, but grounded in that fragile bond neither had asked for, but both had chosen. And when they returned, mud-soaked and trembling, but alive, Eleanor was waiting at the porch lantern held high. She didn't speak as Silas led Shadowfire back into the yard. She only reached out her hand, brushing Silas's wrist for the briefest second. It was enough. The storm left the valley scarred. Fences lay scattered like broken ribs. The creek had swollen into a snarling river that swallowed half the lower pasture, and trees that had stood for decades now lay splintered across the fields. But when dawn broke, a hush settled over the ranch, the kind that follows disaster but carries the quiet promise of survival. Silas walked the wreckage with heavy boots and heavier thoughts. His muscles ached from the night's ride, his clothes still damp, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in years. Shadowfire trailed at his side, not tethered, not forced, but moving of his own will, his black coat gleaming wet under the morning sun. The horse's presence was no longer defiance. It was partnership forged in thunder and lightning. Eleanor met them at the corral. Her eyes were red from a night without sleep, but her posture was unbroken. She reached out and laid her hand against Shadowfire's neck, her touch lingering longer than before. The stallion lowered his head, accepting her as he had accepted Silas. She swallowed hard, her gaze drifting to the man who had returned her horse from the jaws of the storm. "You saved him," she said. Silas shook his head. "No, he chose to come back." Their eyes held, and in that silent exchange, truce passed between them that words could not touch. Truce about loss, about survival, about the fragile threads that tie people to hope when the world insists on tearing it away. Work began immediately. The ranch hands moved to mend fences, gather scattered cattle, and clear debris. Silas was in the thick of it, sleeves rolled, sweat mixing with mud, his strength carrying where others faltered. But it wasn't just the work. It was the way he moved through it, with quiet steadiness, with patience for tired men and frightened animals, with a calm that drew others to follow. Eleanor noticed. She watched him shoulder burdens without complaint. Watched the way Shadowfire followed him freely into the fields. Watched the way even the hands who had doubted him began to lean on his presence. He was no longer a stranger. He was becoming part of the ranch, part of her life, though she dared not name what it meant. One evening after a day of rebuilding, she found him sitting on the porch of the north pasture cabin Shadowfire, grazing nearby copper, resting tethered close. The sun was sinking, painting the sky in bruised colors of purple and gold. She carried 2 mugs of coffee and sat beside him without a word. For a long while they drank in silence, listening to the crickets, to the rustle of grass, to the slow settling of the valley after chaos. Then Eleanor spoke. "Samuel used to say storms change everything," she said softly. "He said they don't just tear down fences and uproot trees. They tear down walls inside us too. Walls we didn't even know we built." Silas stared out at the horizon, his thumb tracing the rim of his mug. He was right. Storms don't ask permission. They show you what's worth holding on to. Her breath caught because she knew he wasn't speaking only of the ranch. "I told myself I didn't need anyone after Samuel," she admitted, her voice trembling. That strength meant standing alone. "But last night when Shadowfire ran into that storm, I realized how much I needed someone who could face it with me." She turned to him, her eyes fierce despite the tears gathering there. "I think I need you, Silas." He met her gaze, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to run from what he saw reflected there. He set his mug aside, took her hand gently in his calloused one, and held it as though it was the most fragile, precious thing he had ever been given. "Eleanor?" He said, his voice rough. "I've been drifting so long I forgot what it felt like to belong anywhere. But when I rode that horse, when I stood in that storm with you, waiting at the porch light, I felt like I'd come home." The words broke something in her, but it was a breaking that healed. She leaned forward and their foreheads touched, their breaths mingling in the twilight. It wasn't passion that burned like wildfire. It was something deeper, steadier, the kind of love that survives storms. In the days that followed, their partnership grew. Silas stayed not as a hired hand, but as something more. Together they rebuilt what the storm had broken, stronger than before. The ranch hands began to look at him with respect, and the town's whispers turned from doubt to grudging admiration. Shadowfire became the symbol of it all. Once untouchable, now he worked beside them, carrying Silas across the range. His wild spirit tempered, but never broken. He was no longer just a challenge, no longer just a prize. He was the living proof that trust could be earned, that broken things could be mended, that wildness could coexist with belonging. One evening, as the first hints of winter crept into the air, Silas and Eleanor stood together by the corral. The stars shone bright overhead and Shadowfire dozed with his head low. "We made it through," she whispered. Silas nodded. "And we'll make it through whatever comes next." She slipped her hand into his and he squeezed gently a vow spoken without words. The valley held its breath, the night wrapping them in stillness. And in that quiet, a new beginning took root, born not from conquest, not from money, not from pride, but from trust, from partnership, and from love that had weathered the storm.